Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The courtroom was filled with hushed murmurs. It had been an ordinary morning, but as soon as she walked in, everything shifted. People stopped talking. Eyes followed her every move. She was used to the whispers. They followed her everywhere, ever since the day it happened. She was used to being the center of attention, but not like this. Never like this. The bailiff called her name, his voice sharp and commanding. It echoed in the silent room, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Miss Wren," he barked. She didn't flinch. She had learned to stop flinching a long time ago. She stood at the back, adjusting the collar of her coat. Her fingers were cold, the tips stiff with the chill in the air. The courtroom lights made her skin look almost translucent, as if she had become part of the building, swallowed up by its walls, its cold atmosphere. Her heels clicked on the floor with each step as she made her way to the front. She walked slowly, deliberately, trying to ignore the stares. Some of the people in the room looked at her with pity. Others with disdain. And a few just watched her as though they were waiting for the next act in a bad play. When she reached the defense table, she placed the folder in front of her, the papers inside rattling just slightly. The judge, a man she knew all too well, didn't even bother to glance up at her. He just shuffled some papers in front of him, his face as emotionless as a statue. "Miss Wren," he said flatly, without raising his gaze. "We've been through this already. You know the outcome. There's nothing new to discuss." She stood tall, her gaze fixed on him. "I believe there is, Your Honor. I've found new evidence." The judge didn't seem to react at first. He continued shuffling through his notes, giving her the sense that she was a mere interruption in his day. He was used to people like her. People who thought they could fight against the system and come out victorious. But the system always won, didn't it? The prosecutor, who had been sitting at the table beside the judge, finally looked up. He stared at her, a smirk forming on his lips. "New evidence," he repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Miss Wren, you've been humiliated enough. Don't you think it's time to let it go?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough of an answer. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the judgment in the eyes of the people who had no idea what she had been through. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about the case. It wasn't about winning or losing in court. This was about something much bigger. Something she had never been able to say out loud, until now. Something that would shake the very foundation of everything they thought they knew. She placed the file down on the table, pushing it across to the judge. The paper slid across the smooth surface with a soft rustle, and for a moment, there was an eerie quiet. The prosecutor reached for the paper first. He glanced at it, then froze. His hand went still. His face drained of color as he read through the contents. "What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The judge, finally raising his eyes, looked over at the prosecutor with a stern expression. "What is it, Mr. Daniels?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of authority that most people found intimidating. The prosecutor swallowed hard. He glanced up at her, then back at the paper. This isn't supposed to exist," he said, his voice shaky. This is. His words trailed off, and for the first time in months, the room was completely silent. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge's eyes narrowed. He set the gavel down gently. "Miss Wren, explain." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath, letting the moment hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. The eyes of the courtroom were on her, some curious, some judgmental, but none of them understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. The prosecutor's face twisted in confusion, then in fear. He leaned over to whisper something to the judge, but the judge didn't answer. He was too busy staring at her, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the years of fighting, the humiliation, the constant struggle to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. She could still hear the laughter from that first trial, the mocking chuckles, the sneers from the gallery. She could still feel the burn of her face turning red when the judge had dismissed her case without a second thought. But that was then. Now, she was standing here, in front of the very people who had written her off, the very people who thought they could bury her with their lies and their system. But what they didn't know, what they could never have known, was that she had been paying attention. She had been watching, learning, waiting for this moment. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her voice was steady as she finally spoke. "This document," she said, her words cutting through the tension, "contains evidence of a crime that has been covered up for years. A crime that involves more than just me. A crime that involves people in this very room." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Some people shifted nervously in their seats, others exchanged glances. But the judge remained still, his gaze unflinching. "Miss Wren," he began, his tone measured but firm, "if this is another one of your—" "It's not," she interrupted, her voice growing louder now. "This is real. It's the truth. And I have proof." The prosecutor looked like he was about to explode. His face was flushed, his lips pressed tight. "You have no right to bring this up," he snapped. "This is a courtroom, not some—" The judge raised his hand, silencing him immediately. "Enough, Mr. Daniels. Let her speak." She didn't waste any more time. "I have the names. The dates. The evidence that proves everything you've been hiding." The prosecutor stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped against the floor. "You're delusional," he spat. "You're wasting everyone's time." But the judge wasn't looking at the prosecutor anymore. His eyes were locked on her. He looked intrigued. And that was the first crack in the armor. She could feel the shift, the change in the air. People were starting to realize this wasn't just a desperate plea for attention. This wasn't just some woman who had failed in the courtroom and was trying to reclaim her dignity. This was something much bigger. She didn't look away from the judge's gaze. "You know what I'm talking about. You know this is bigger than just me. And you know that if you cover this up, it won't just destroy me. It will destroy everything you've worked for." The judge didn't say anything. His face was hard, unreadable. But she could see it in his eyes. He was thinking. He was wondering just how deep this rabbit hole went. Then, as if to punctuate the moment, the door to the courtroom creaked open. The sound wasn't loud. But it was enough to make everyone turn their heads. A man in a gray coat stepped in. His face was unreadable, his posture straight, as though he had every right to be there. His eyes swept over the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw recognition in them. But then it was gone. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Not ever. She stepped back instinctively, her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat. The judge looked up, confusion flashing across his face. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply walked forward, slow and measured, like he knew the exact effect his presence was having. And then their eyes met. And she knew. It was him. The one who had disappeared. The one who had left her to pick up the pieces of a life she never asked for. The one who had made her a target in the first place. The man in the gray coat stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. There was no mistaking it now, she had seen that face before, years ago. The man who had disappeared without a trace. The man who had left her, alone and vulnerable, to face a world that hadn't been kind. Her breath hitched in her chest, and she instinctively stepped back, trying to compose herself. But her mind was racing. Was this some twisted joke? Or had she truly just seen him walk back into her life? The courtroom fell into complete silence, as if they were all holding their collective breath, waiting for something to break. Everyone else was still looking at the man, their expressions confused, unsure of what had just happened. No one dared to speak. The judge, still seated behind the bench, furrowed his brow. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice firm, but there was an edge of curiosity now. He was the only one who hadn't recognized the man yet. But she had. Her legs felt weak as she tried to steady herself against the table. She wanted to speak, to shout at him, to demand answers. But nothing came out. Her throat was dry, her mind swirling with 1,000 questions. How was he here? Why now? The man in the gray coat finally turned his attention to the judge. "I'm here because I need to speak," he said calmly, his voice smooth and controlled. "This woman," he said, pointing toward her, "is not who you think she is. She's not the person you've made her out to be." His words landed like a blow to her chest. She had no idea what he was talking about. She couldn't even think straight. The room was spinning, and she felt like she was about to fall. He was here. The ghost from her past. The man who had disappeared without a word. And now he was making her the target again. The judge looked between them, his confusion growing. "I'm afraid I don't understand," he said, glancing back at Miss Wren. "Do you know this man, Miss Wren?" She could barely bring herself to speak. Her mouth was dry, her voice caught in her throat. But she managed to nod slowly, her eyes not leaving the man in the gray coat. "Yes," she whispered. "I know him. His name is Thomas Hall. And he's the reason I'm here." The prosecutor, who had been silent until now, shot her a skeptical look. "Mr. Hall? That's impossible. He disappeared years ago. He's been dead for—" Thomas Hall cut him off, his voice cutting through the air like a razor. "I'm very much alive, Mr. Daniels," he said. "And I've come to make sure the truth finally comes out." The prosecutor's face drained of color. This is absurd," he muttered, his eyes darting between the judge and Thomas, his confusion growing. But the judge wasn't so easily dismissed. "So you're telling me," he began slowly, "that you've been alive all these years, and now you've decided to show up at this trial? Why?" Thomas looked at the judge with an almost casual indifference. "Because Miss Wren is telling the truth. And she deserves to be heard. Unlike the people in this room who have lied and manipulated the situation from the very beginning." The air in the courtroom seemed to crackle with tension. Every eye was on Thomas, waiting for him to explain further. But he didn't. Instead, he glanced back at Miss Wren, his expression unreadable. Her heart was racing now, but she knew she couldn't just stand there. She had to speak. She had to explain everything. If only she could remember all the details, all the facts. But how could she when everything felt like it had been turned upside down? "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here now, after all this time?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something in his gaze, a familiarity, a hint of something she couldn't quite place. But it wasn't enough to erase the bitterness she felt. How many times had she thought about him? How many nights had she cried, wondering why he'd abandoned her? "I'm here because it's time to set things right," he finally said, his tone soft but filled with determination. "You've suffered long enough. And it's time for the truth to come out. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been affected by this mess." A mess. That was what he called it. Miss Wren wanted to scream, to demand more answers. But instead, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It had been years since she'd last seen Thomas. Years since he had disappeared without a word. She never imagined he would show up in her life again, especially not like this. Her thoughts were interrupted when the judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Miss Wren, would you like to explain to the court what's going on here?" She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She hadn't planned for this. She had planned on coming here, proving her case, and walking away with a sense of justice. But now? Now it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under her. Thomas stood still, his face unreadable, as if he were waiting for her to speak. Finally, she found her voice. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice trembling. "You all think I'm here to win a case, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I need to make sure the truth comes out. I need to make sure that the people who destroyed my life are held accountable." Thomas glanced at her with something like pity in his eyes, and then he nodded. "That's why I'm here, too." The prosecutor, who had been watching them closely, stepped forward, his face contorted with disbelief. "This is insane," he spat. "You've been dead for years. How is this possible? You're nothing but a figment of her imagination." Thomas didn't even look at him. He was still focused on Miss Wren, his eyes softening with a mixture of sympathy and regret. "I'm not a figment of anyone's imagination, Mr. Daniels," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm very real. And I'm here to make sure the truth finally comes to light." The judge, who had been watching the back and forth with growing concern, stood up. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice stern. "I don't know what this is, but I'm not going to allow this trial to be turned into some sort of circus. If you have something to say, Mr. Hall, you will have to do it in the proper manner. Until then, Miss Wren, we will proceed with your case." But Thomas wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his eyes still locked on Miss Wren. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "But I can't let this go. Not anymore." Before anyone could stop him, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick file. He placed it on the defense table with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating through the room. Miss Wren's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the file. It was thick, well-worn, as though it had been through a lot. Thomas slid it toward her, and she opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside the file were photographs, lots of them. And handwritten notes. And documents. "Everything you need to know is in there," Thomas said quietly. "Everything about what happened that day. Everything about the lies they've told you. Everything they've kept hidden." She flipped through the file, her eyes wide with shock. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. There were names she recognized. People she thought she could trust. And there it was, the truth. The courtroom was still. No one moved. No one breathed. But she knew. She knew everything now. The courtroom was thick with silence. All eyes were on her, waiting, watching as she flipped through the file in her hands. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. But there was no turning back now. She had seen the truth. Finally, after all these years, and there was no way to unsee it. She closed the file slowly, her hands trembling. Her head was spinning, her thoughts a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and anger. She had spent so much of her life trying to make sense of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the broken promises, but now, the truth was right in front of her. And it was worse than anything she could have imagined. She glanced up, meeting the eyes of the judge. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something that looked like doubt. And that was a start. At least he wasn't dismissing her outright anymore. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was glaring at her, his jaw clenched tightly. He looked like he was about to burst. His face was red, his eyes burning with frustration. But she didn't care anymore. She didn't care about what he thought, what anyone thought. The only thing that mattered now was exposing the truth. "Miss Wren," the judge said, his voice a bit softer now, though still authoritative, would you care to explain what's in that file? She took a deep breath and stood tall. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. Everything you need to know is in there, she said, nodding to the file. The names, the dates, the evidence. Everything. The prosecutor opened his mouth to speak, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him. The judge's gaze never left Miss Wren as he spoke again, his tone firm. Miss Wren, I need to know what exactly we're looking at here. I need you to explain what this all means. She looked down at the file, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the papers. Her mind was racing. How could she explain something so complicated, so painful, in a way that would make sense to everyone in this room? But she had to try. She took another deep breath. What's in this file is the truth. The truth about what happened all those years ago. The truth about the case I've been fighting all this time. The prosecutor let out an incredulous laugh. The truth? Miss Wren, do you really expect us to believe this? That this man, he gestured toward Thomas, has been alive all this time and suddenly decides to show up to tell us the truth? I don't expect you to believe me, she replied, her voice steady, but I'm telling you the truth. I have proof. The people in this room, she gestured to the others, they have been lying to you. They've been lying to all of us. The prosecutor's face twisted in anger. You're accusing me of lying, he spat, stepping closer to her. I've worked in this courtroom for years. I've handled cases far more complicated than yours. And now you come here with some file, expecting me to believe this nonsense? I'm not accusing you, she said, her voice never wavering. I'm showing you the facts. And if you choose to ignore them, that's on you. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything. He just glared at her, his fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the room was suffocating. Everyone was watching, waiting for something to happen, for someone to make the next move. The judge broke the silence, his voice steady. Enough. Miss Wren, if what you say is true, then we need to look at this evidence. I will order a recess so that we can thoroughly review the documents in that file. Until then, I expect both of you to remain calm and refrain from any further outbursts. The prosecutor opened his mouth to protest, but the judge gave him a sharp look. We will have no more interruptions. Understood? The prosecutor's shoulders stiffened, but he nodded reluctantly. The judge turned to the bailiff. Take the file and make copies. I'll need them distributed to the relevant parties before we reconvene. As the bailiff took the file away, Miss Wren could feel the eyes on her again. But this time, it wasn't just the usual judgment. There was something else. Suspicion. Uncertainty. Even a little fear. She felt a strange sense of satisfaction, though it was fleeting. She had done what she set out to do. She had brought the truth to light. But now, she had to wonder, what would happen next? Would anyone believe her? Would they see the evidence for what it was? Her thoughts were interrupted when Thomas stepped toward her, his presence suddenly so close that she could feel the heat of his body. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside the courtroom disappeared. Then the moment passed, and she was back in the reality of the situation. She had no idea what was going to happen now. But she knew one thing for sure, the fight was far from over. The recess was called, and everyone began to file out of the courtroom. Miss Wren stood there, still gripping the edge of the defense table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The room was buzzing with low conversations, but she couldn't make out the words. It was all a blur. She was too lost in her own thoughts to notice the figure approaching her until he was standing right in front of her. Thomas. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she was. She was far from okay. But she had to be strong now. For herself. For the truth. "I never wanted you to go through all of this," Thomas said, his eyes filled with something like regret. "I never wanted to hurt you." She shook her head. "You did, Thomas. You hurt me more than you'll ever understand. And now you've come back, but it's too late for apologies. You don't get to walk back into my life and pretend like nothing happened." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stood there, looking at her with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. But then he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "I know," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I am here now. And I'm not going anywhere until I make things right. You deserve that much." She didn't know how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to shout at him, to tell him he was too late, that she had moved on, that he had no place in her life anymore. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the man she once loved, wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that, despite everything, he was truly sorry. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except what was about to happen in that courtroom. She couldn't afford to get lost in the past, not now. Not when everything was finally on the line. The bailiff returned, signaling that it was time to return to court. Miss Wren took one last look at Thomas, her emotions a tangled mess, before turning toward the door. As she walked back into the courtroom, the weight of what was coming hit her again. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But she was ready. The courtroom was filled with a tense, suffocating silence as everyone took their seats. The air felt thick, heavy with expectation. Miss Wren felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, and despite the cooling breeze from the air conditioner above, she was drenched in sweat. She could hear the murmurs in the room. Whispers of disbelief, of confusion, of doubt. The entire day had been like a series of bombshells, and now they were all waiting to see if the final truth would land, like a force too powerful to ignore. The judge had called everyone back to order. His expression was stern, but there was a quiet uncertainty behind his eyes, the same uncertainty that had been hanging in the air since Thomas Hall had appeared in the courtroom. The prosecutor sat stiffly at his desk, his face contorted in frustration. He had done everything in his power to discredit Miss Wren, to dismiss the documents that Thomas had presented, but nothing had worked. Every attempt to squash her evidence had failed. Now, he was barely holding on, trying to keep his composure. But it was clear that the ground beneath him was slipping away. Miss Wren had expected this moment, but that didn't make it any easier. She had come so far, had fought so hard, and now the truth was here. The truth that would finally set things right. She hoped. The judge cleared his throat and looked at Miss Wren. "Miss Wren, you may continue. Please, present your final evidence." Her heart was racing, but she nodded. She stood slowly, gathering the strength to face the court one last time. The weight of all the years of suffering, of humiliation, was still with her, but it didn't matter now. She was in control. And she had the truth on her side. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, where a large display screen had been set up. The file Thomas had handed her, the one with the evidence, she had carefully prepared the key documents for this moment. She glanced at Thomas, sitting quietly in the back. He wasn't standing with her now, but his presence felt like a quiet support. After everything, she hadn't expected to feel anything other than anger toward him. But in this moment, with the truth laid bare, the anger seemed irrelevant. She had spent so many years trying to make sense of what he had done, but now, it wasn't about him. It was about her, and the justice she had been denied for so long. The screen flickered to life, and she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, what you're about to see is the final piece of the puzzle. The last shred of evidence that will explain everything." She paused, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "This is not just about me. This is about the people who tried to destroy my life. The people who have been lying to you all. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face red with outrage. Objection, he yelled. This is irrelevant. You cannot. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. Let her speak, Mr. Daniels. I'll allow it. Miss Wren took a deep breath and clicked a button. The first image flashed on the screen, an official-looking document with a seal, but it was the names listed that made her blood run cold. It was a list of names, names she had never seen before, names she had never been told about. These names, she said, pointing to the screen, are the people who were involved in the cover-up. The people who knew the truth about what happened to me all those years ago. And most importantly, the people who kept me from getting justice. There was a murmur from the crowd, a ripple of disbelief spreading like wildfire. She could see the prosecutor's face contorting with confusion and then, the tiniest flicker of realization. He knew these names. He recognized some of them. One name stood out to her, Benjamin Fuller. The name was in bold, and as she spoke it aloud, she watched the prosecutor's face drain of color. Benjamin Fuller, she said, her voice unwavering. He was the man behind everything. The man who orchestrated the entire thing. He's the one who planted false evidence, who set up the case against me. He was the one who manipulated the system, and he was the one who made sure I went down for something I never did. The prosecutor's expression shifted again, this time to something more complicated, more dangerous. He took a step back, as if he were trying to process what was happening, but Miss Wren wasn't finished. She clicked the button again, and a new image appeared. This time, it was a photograph, grainy and faded, but clear enough. It showed Benjamin Fuller, standing beside a group of people. And among them was none other than the prosecutor himself, standing with a smug expression, his arm draped around Fuller's shoulder. Do you see this? She asked, turning toward the prosecutor. You've been involved with Benjamin Fuller from the very beginning. You've known the truth all along. The prosecutor's face twisted in an ugly sneer. He didn't even try to deny it. You have no idea what you're talking about, he spat. You have no evidence. This is all fabricated. Oh, I have more than just that photograph, she replied, her voice ice cold. I have everything. She clicked again, and another document appeared, this one a set of emails. The emails had been hidden away, buried under layers of bureaucracy and legal jargon. But now, they were finally out in the open. They detailed the communications between the prosecutor and Benjamin Fuller, discussing how to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. The emails talked about manipulating witnesses, planting false evidence, and ensuring that no one would ever believe her. Miss Wren's heart pounded in her chest as she read aloud the damning words. I'll take care of everything. No one will ever know the truth. She'll pay for what she did. The prosecutor's face had gone ashen. His mouth was open, but no words came out. He looked at the judge, as though hoping he would intervene, but the judge was silent, watching the screen with an expression of disbelief. You had every opportunity to come forward, Miss Wren said, her eyes locked onto the prosecutor. But you didn't. Instead, you made sure the lies kept piling up. You made sure I was silenced. The courtroom was silent. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone was watching, waiting for the next move. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Mr. Daniels, do you have any explanation for what we've just seen? The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had been caught in the act, his defenses shattered. There was nothing left to say. The judge waited for a moment longer before turning toward Miss Wren. You may rest your case. It's clear that you've been wronged in the worst way possible. A wave of relief washed over her. Finally, after all these years, it was over. The truth had come to light. The people who had wronged her would no longer be able to hide. The prosecutor was escorted out of the courtroom in shame, his head hung low. Benjamin Fuller's name was now at the center of a police investigation. The lies were unraveling, piece by piece. As the courtroom emptied, Miss Wren felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, vindication, but also sorrow. The years of pain and suffering couldn't be erased, and while the truth had come to light, the scars would remain. But that didn't matter anymore. She had taken back control of her life. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing of all. She turned to Thomas, who had stayed in the back of the courtroom throughout the entire ordeal. He walked toward her slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then he spoke, his voice soft. "You did it." She nodded, her throat tight. "We did it." There was a long pause before Thomas spoke again, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I never meant for you to go through all of this," he said. "I was a fool." "You were," she replied, her voice steady. "But we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward." He nodded. "So, what happens now?" Miss Wren looked up at the courtroom doors, the light streaming in from the outside. "Now," she said softly, "we rebuild." And for the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe.